Good Vach. I want to share with you tonight an incredible story. It's one of my favorite stories, and it really highlights the otherworldly connection that a tzaddik has with every single Jew, especially the Moshe Rabbeinu, the Moses of the generation, connection with literally every single Jew, even Jews who you think have no connection at all. The story takes us back to 1958. 1958, there was a man named David Avram Lisselbaum. He lived in Kfar Chabad, and he shared a story personally, his own personal story, about a cousin of his wife whose name was Yaakov Zerubbabel. Yaakov Zerubbabel was part of a leftist Israeli political faction, which was called Polei Tzion HaSmolit. He worked, while still in Poland, together with Ben Gurion and Mensvi and others who were the top of the political party. And not only did he work there in Poland, but he managed to guide the party significantly. He connected the party with another faction, Tnu'a al-Achdut HaAvodah, which eventually joined with another political faction called Hashomer HaTzair, which is much more famous, and which was a source of Mapam. And eventually this led to the birth of the Israeli political group, which is very famous, Meretz, which is very anti-religious, anti-Jewish, anti-God. And Yaakov Zerubbabel was actually very influential in a very sad part of our history. Olei Teiman, many Jews who immigrated to Israel from Yemen, as soon as they came to Yemen, the Israel sent to Yemen people to tell the very naive, very trusting souls in Yemen about how their children should come with them to Israel, and they're in Israel, they'll be taken care of, and they'll be given opportunities. And as soon as these boys and girls arrived in Israel, unfortunately, the very left-wing, anti-religious groups tried to indoctrinate them into their philosophy and their ideology, and this Yaakov Zerubbabel was involved. I mean, like literally, there was this. I don't know what's documented, what's not documented, what's true, what's not true, what's exaggerated. But the way I always heard the story is that Israel, unfortunately, allowed children, as soon as they arrived in Israel, cutting off their payas, taking off their tzitzis, telling them there's all fairy tales. And there's famous discussion about Israel actually telling parents that their children died, and for many, many years, there's a lot of classified information about many of the children that came from Yemen to Israel that parents don't know. They were told their children died, and they didn't die, and they're just that Israel didn't want the children to go back to the old ways of their parents, and therefore they told the parents that the children died. So this Yaakov Zerubbabel, he was highly influential in this activity, and he had this Chabad cousin, David Avram Lisselbaum. David Avram Lisselbaum didn't have too much to do with this cousin of his wife's, but every year before Passover, he would go and bring him matzah. Matzah is called the food of faith. And this man, who was not known to be very full of faith, he probably thought he needs an extra dosage of matzah. So he would visit him every year. They had a friendly relationship. He never tried to engage him in discussion of religious matters, because Yaakov Zerubbabel was very antagonistic. He was a gifted author. In fact, he was the librarian of of the merits of the name of their archives. He was the master of the archives of Sifriyat HaPoalim. That's the name of the archives of their books. Meretz believed that early on that they're putting out publications that express their ideology and their doctrine and their propaganda. They'll be able to influence segments of the population to go along with their heretical beliefs. So he was the secretary of the archives. He was such a intellectual person that this simple chassid from Kfar Chabad, Rabbi Moshe Levin, didn't feel like he was able to engage with him intellectually, and he didn't try. And he was teaching in this little village in Israel, Moshav Barosh, and he would visit him once a year and bring him matzah. And as a faithful chassid, he would write to the Rebbe about his various things he would do, and he wrote also about his visit to this noted author Yaakov Zerubbabel. So he received a very unusual letter. The most unusual thing about this story I'm telling you is that it's a true story. If you actually read the letter, which I'm going to read you right now. I'm reading you from the original copy of the letter. It's a little hard for me to read it because it's hard to read the way I have it over here. But it's printed in the Rebbe's letters as well. I don't have it with me. I'm going to try to read to you the original letter. This is in response to David Avram's letter to the Rebbe about his meeting with Yaakov Zerubbabel. After a very long interval, I received your letter, and I was gratified to read about your activities in this past month of Tishrei. Since you write that time to time you visit with Mr. Zerubbabel, certainly you know his power of influence is very great, and therefore you should use your meeting with him to inspire him. And since his activities are in a negative, because he got very used to doing this, and not because he meditated now and he came to a conclusion that he has to act this way. It wasn't because he came to this conclusion through deep thought, rather it was because he got used to this habit. So if you will inspire him time after time, without stopping, or continuously, time after time, whenever you meet him, to tell him about the great destruction and damage he is causing through his activities, and how he could use his talents in the positive, to add goodness to the world in general, and especially to add goodness to Jewish people. So in the end, your words will be effective, because truth must always be victorious. Truth must always be victorious. And so therefore, if you will continuously speak to him again and again, truth will be victorious, although it may take time. It's understood that when you talk to him about this, the greatest opposition will be that it says in the beginning of the Code of Jewish Law, a person should not be embarrassed from those who scorn them. So it's understood that it'll be hard for Zerubbabel, in other words, to change his ways, because it's hard. He's going to have to contend with the embarrassment that this may bring him. However, if he will meditate about his path until now, and when he will come to the opposite conclusion, and he will publicize this without any excuse, it may be very, very embarrassing. However, as I hear, as is known, the way Zerubbabel, the Rebbe writes to this cousin of his, Mr. Lisselbaum, the way Zerubbabel's acted, he doesn't really care about what public opinion is. He's very outspoken. Doesn't care what people say about him. And if in the negative he does this, he doesn't care to say things which are very against what people think, how much more so should he use his courage in the positive? And he could say, whatever I told you till now, I made a mistake. He could do this. Now, be Hashem's will that you also should not be embarrassed, and you should speak to him about all the above, and tell him the truth, and tell him also, this is what's unbelievable, tell him words that come from the heart, which you promise words that come from the heart enter the heart, and you also have permission to tell him that I am asking you to tell him this, and you also could add to him that you could also add to him the following. Here's unbelievable. Listen to this. You could also add to him the following. You have also had doubts, but you've tried to silence your doubts. And as soon as they come into your mind, your doubts about your opinion till now, you push them out of your mind. And the nature of people is that when something comes that will force them to change their path in life, which requires a lot of courage, so people try to push out of their mind. But because you have influence on many, that means when you fix up yourself, that will your correcting yourself will cause your correction of yourself will have impact that's double and quadrupled among all those that you are connected to. You have to you have to be courageous and go forward. And Rebbe adds to him and says that a sign that a sign that this is the time for you to make this decision is the dream. A sign that to your relative the time has come to make this courageous move is, what's the sign? Is the dream that you had right before your visit. In other words, tell your relative, tell Mr. Zerubbabel that the reason why now is the time that you should listen to all those voices in your head and actually make the move is because of the dream, a sign this is the time, is a dream that you had recently. And yeah, that's the sign. That's what we should tell him. Okay. So that's the words that writes to this Mr. Rabbi David Avram Lisselbaum. It's a very powerful, unusual letter. I don't know if another occasion they ever told someone, pay attention to the dream you had lately, but that's they're told him. And he asks him to go and share this with him and tell him he has permission to say the Rebbe sent me. But Rabbi Lisselbaum didn't do it. He didn't do it because it was a hard thing to do. And he put it off. He didn't decide not to do it, but he just put it off. He didn't want to do it. But something negative happened in his family. He doesn't say what it was. Because this negative event that happened in his family, he attributed this negative occurrence with his resistance to follow the Rebbe's instruction. And so he immediately decided he has to do his mission. This mission that was given to him by the Rebbe, he has to go do this. And he calls up Mr. Zerubbabel, and he says to him, I have a mission for you from the Rebbe. Okay, please, I want to hear what it is. Please come over to my office. So he comes over to Mr. Zerubbabel's office. He had an office in this government place called Beit Hastadrut. And he comes in the office, and Mr. Zerubbabel stands up, which is unusual. He's always very scornful about anything religious. He says, please tell me what the Rebbe says. So instead of telling him what the Rebbe said, he said, I choose to just read you the letter. And he reads to him the letter. And Mr. Zerubbabel listens to the words of the letter, does not say a word. Now, Rabbi Lisselbaum knows this guy very well. And he knows that Zerubbabel has something to say, he says it. And he says it very sharply and very pointedly and very abrasively. And if he's not saying anything, that means that he really is affected by what the Rebbe said. But he doesn't say anything. He just, in passing, as he's leaving, he says, can you please send me a copy of this letter? Send me please a copy of the letter. I said, okay, no problem. He leaves Mr. Zerubbabel's office. He goes back home to Kfar Chabad. He sits down and writes a letter to the Rebbe and tells the Rebbe about his encounter with Mr. Zerubbabel and how he asked nonchalantly for the letter. So the Rebbe responded that do not give him the letter yet with his nonchalant request. Only if Mr. Zerubbabel will look for an opportunity to meet you, or he writes to you, and he specifically asks for the letter, then do this. But till then, do not do anything about this. Do not do anything about this. So, and Rebbe also uses a very unusual expression. He says, I did my mission. I did my mission here too. In other words, Rebbe is giving information over here to this Lisselbaum, Mr. Lisselbaum, that the Rebbe has a mission over here that he's been given from on high to tell this to Mr. Zerubbabel. And if he doesn't ask for the letter, the Rebbe said, I did my job. I did what I was asked to do. Okay. So Mr. Zerubbabel and Rabbi Lisselbaum do not end up meeting. In fact, Rabbi Lisselbaum made sure not to attend any family function in order they shouldn't encounter Mr. Zerubbabel, so that if Mr. Zerubbabel indeed really wanted the letter, he would have to reach out to him. So about a year passes. And when he comes again to Mr. Zerubbabel to give him matzah for Passover again, and in this time when he visits him, Mr. Zerubbabel is very angry. He says, Yaakov Zerubbabel says to Rav David Avram Lisselbaum, he says, why didn't you send me the letter? I wanted the letter. How come you didn't send it to me? So this was what he was waiting for. And of course, shortly afterwards, he sent him the letter. After this event, Mr. Zerubbabel came to Kfar Chabad wearing a kippah, which was doesn't sound like a big deal, but coming from where he was coming from, this was a huge thing. And he passed away. Shortly afterwards. He passed away before the 6-Day War. So Rabbi Lisselbaum and he did not meet again. But this was a very strong impression on him. And many of his grandchildren today are religious Jews because of this connection that was made because of the dream that he had lately. We don't know what the dream was, but the one who knew the sign that he needed to hear, he was given that sign. As this first story I want to share, one more story, maybe two. This is a story about, on the same note, the previous Rebbe once had an audience with Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Hecht al Shalom. He's the oldest of the Hecht brothers, who was sent by the previous Rebbe to Chicago. And the previous Rebbe shared with him the following story about his father, whose anniversary of passing was just this past Friday. He said that his father was working very hard to protect the Jewish people and Judaism in Russia in a very difficult time. And there were a lot of decrees coming from Petersburg, from Moscow, and his father had to travel to the higher echelons in the government to protect Jewish interests. And there was one meeting that his father was invited to that was attended by 70 other rabbis and also government officials. And among them, there was a Jewish lawyer who was also a government official. And he presented at this meeting his belief of how he thinks things should change in Russia. One thing he said that should change is that there shouldn't be any issue with Jews marrying non-Jews. Jews should be allowed to marry non-Jews. What's wrong with a Jew marrying a non-Jew? And other things in that vein. The Rebbe Rashab stood up And the Rebbe Rashab said, "Wie can sein? How could it be, as a geborene Yid, that a Jew who was born a Jew could speak in such a way?" This man was thunderstruck. He was thunderstruck, and he sat down and he started to cry. And after this meeting was over, he asked to speak to the Rebbe Rashab. He spoke to him privately, and he was visibly affected by this encounter. And a short while later, he also, as in the first story, he made more than the first story, he made very strong steps in his Judaism, to the extent that he became a fully observant Jew. And Rabbi Mendel Chaim, al Shalom, who met him years after, he said to him, "What was it that happened, that encounter that moved you so much?" So he said that when the Rebbe spoke, he was able to sense that truth was speaking. And because of truth, he was taken by the truth. As Rebbe Rashab once said, "Farn emes vern ala batel." In front of the truth, everyone has deference, is humble before the truth. So the previous Rebbe shared the story to Shem Zalman Hecht, and he said to him, as Rebbe Rashab said before he passed away, "I'm going to heaven, but my writing is you have my writings. I'm leaving my writings with you." And as the Rebbe explained, that what that means is not just that we have his writings, but wherever there are Chassidim living, said the previous Rebbe, the Rebbe is with them, and the Chassidim have to devote themselves to the Rebbe. And by devoting themselves to him, they're able to also to accomplish anything. That's what the previous Rebbe told by Shem Zalman Hecht about his mission in Moscow, in Chicago. Okay, one more story in the same vein. There was another writer. His name was Avigdor HaMeiri. Avigdor HaMeiri was also a very noted writer in Israel. He was born in Hungary in 1890. He learned in the yeshiva Chassam Sofer in Pressburg in Czechoslovakia, but he left Torah mitzvahs and he became a very noted writer. And he began talking to a chassid whose name was Meir Blazinski. In 1940, Reb Meir Blazinski came to the Meiri household to sell bread. And the Mr. Meiri says, "Well, I am the noted author Avigdor Meiri." And so basically they began studying together. And Avigdor HaMeiri was learning with Rabbi Meir Blazinski, and he was trying to soften his position, many of his positions on Jews and Judaism, and he was successful to some extent. But more than that, Rabbi Blazinski inspired Mr. Meiri to travel to the Rebbe. He wrote among his heretical books. He wrote a terrible book about some Jew, a rabbi who committed suicide. A fabricated story about a rabbi who survived the Holocaust, committed suicide. A horrible book. The Rebbe actually writes about the book. It was hard to read the book, and it's a book that caused a lot of pain. Anyways, he visits the Rebbe, and the Rebbe asked him a very interesting question, a question that really made him think. The Rebbe asked him, "What are you giving the youth? What are you giving the youth?" And so this question caused him to change his whole attitude in life, to being, the intellectual who wants the answers, to being the guy who is looking to answer the question, what's his role? What does he need to do to help young people? And Rabbi Blazinski and he worked together to help him define what he could do to help young people. And actually, the Rebbe himself, when Rabbi Blazinski visited the Rebbe to receive wine for a blessing, the Rebbe asked to please send wine to this Avigdor HaMeiri. Anyways, the point of all these three stories is that in every generation there's a tzaddik who has a connection with every single Jew and knows the way to each Jew's heart, And just like we read in this Torah portion that Hashem calls unto Moshe, He calls to Moshe's name with love and reaches out to Moshe. And so to every generation, Hashem gives the Moshe of generation the tools of how to reach every Jew's heart. And this is what the Rebbe is doing through all of his emissaries throughout the world, reaching out to all the thousands and millions of Jews throughout the world. And we need to be part of it. We need to be part of the mission and ask the question to ourselves, what are we doing for the young people? And how can we find another Jew who may not have a place to go for the Seder, who may not have matzah yet, and to help them feel the joy and happiness and beauty of our heritage. So I want to share and have a wonderful good Tavach, a freilich Tavach.